Thank you, Roger. Good morning, everybody. Very interesting. I haven't seen Mark's presentation before just then, and the take-home message is almost the same. I'm now going to talk about variation, particularly in progeny, but the solution comes back to the same things: lactation intakes, minimising change in sow body condition, and not having overweight sows. Same deal. Isn't that interesting? And if I had $10 to spend...
I learned from you.
Oh, well. If I had $10 to spend on nutrition, I'd spend $9.80 on those three things. Right, today we're talking about containing the cost of variation in pork production systems, and you saw yesterday that from time to time we're accused of being factory farmers. And my answer is, if only we were factory farmers. Just imagine, we've got all our inputs in exactly the right quantities that we need them. They're all exactly the right size. They all come into the system at exactly the right time. We can get everything to fit in exactly the same space before we start, after we finish. Life would be a dream. And we're nowhere near this. So I'll have an argument with you if you want to call us a factory farm. Just imagine if you're running this production line and every door was a different size, every car was a different size. It'd go broke in a couple of days, wouldn't it? Same deal. Now, we're also a bit clever in the pork industry. We take these brand new cars, pay brand new car price, and then cut them up into bits and try and sell them for more than the total cost of the car. That's another challenge. So, but it's interesting, if you would apply that to other industries, you wouldn't be around for very long. So factory farm's an absolute furphy. We've got much bigger challenges to deal with. How many people here sell pigs, and how many sell them in one cut? Who clears a shed in one go? Really? Good luck. I wish I could do that. It's very rare. And in fact, we don't have any idea how much variation we have on our farms, because we're always selecting, and we're selecting for specific markets. We don't even know if it's normal. We assume it's a normal distribution. In an ideal world, we would have a market for every part of that distribution every week. Wouldn't that be fantastic? They all balanced up. The stuff that went to butchers, you know, we had enough of them, and exactly the right balance to supermarkets, exactly the right amount for, you know, domestic carcasses, exactly the right number for export, and then we even had a market for our heavies. That would just be ideal. But reality is very different. And of course, we have varying demands for different markets that we have to somehow pull from that distribution. And that is the beginning of the problem. We create a massive amount of variation in trying to achieve the right number of pigs into these markets. That's the nature of pork production in Australia. And it starts the problem off from there. There's also this issue of Christmas, where we do, sell twice as many pigs for 4 weeks of the year around Christmas. And we get a bit of a premium. If you sit down and work out what that premium is worth relative to what that extra supply costs you over the course of the year, you might be having another discussion. It costs us a fortune, not only in how we try and manage those extra pigs through a big chunk of the year to get enough numbers, how we hold pigs back, how we bring them forward, the costs in terms of stocking density changes, the return on assets. We would be appalled if we actually had a real number on that cost. And it creates more problems for the rest of the year. So Christmas is not a happy time. Then we've got this issue that we have to sell the whole pig, right? We're not just selling this bit for bacon, and that has a whole stack of other connotations. That's why we have such a significant proportion of imports into the country, because you can order up exactly the right size middle to go into your machines to produce the same size bacon every day of the week. You know that imports for those processes cost us money as pork producers. So start adding these up when you start talking about the cost of variation. And then we've just heard about the consequences of the sun. Who walked over here this morning? Were you comfortable? Yep. As soon as the temperature goes over the temperature that it was this morning, when you walked across, you in theory have a sow in heat stress. Right? So we're operating for most of the year outside of a realm of comfort when we're talking about heat stress. For those of you that are involved in the PIC Elite Benchmarking Program, and I apologise to the sponsors of the session, but that's where the data come from, you're going to get a report this month where we've actually taken 5 years worth of data over 13 lunar months and looked at the pigs weaned per 100 sows served, and just looked at the variation across the course of the year. This one overall seems to be going in the right direction. And remember that the lulls are 4 months out of whack, so the lows actually correlate to the summer matings. But this farm here has gone from 480 in June to 850 in February. That's going to be hard to manage in terms of maintaining constant flows, optimum stocking densities, how many pigs you're going to how many sows you're going to mate. Look at that. That's an enormous range. And it's varying very significantly from year to year. Here's one that's not as bad. It's going a little downhill, but the range is a lot less. So this, in my mind, is probably a better scenario than the previous one because we've got less range to deal with. We're only going from 790 to 850. But when you start putting some real numbers around that, we're in an impossible situation when that's our starting point. That's what we're dealing with. So you start putting numbers around summer infertility in Australia and the overall consequences. They are quite diabolical, and they actually generate more variation in the system as a consequence. So when you're talking about the cost, what's the flow-on effect? What is the cost? Well, first of all, we all select on farm to meet a market specification. So we don't know what that distribution looks like because we tend to cut it off to meet specific grids. Well, that costs money. You have to have somebody there selecting, you're reboxing pigs, that reduces their production efficiency. It's an actual significant cost to the business. We also have nutritionists that spend a lot of time fine-tuning diets for a class of pig. Poor match of diet specifications to nutrient requirements is a cost. But let's have a look at this data that's not new, but it shows you how variation changes from weaning, say at 19 days, up to sale at 140. These pigs were weaning at 5.4 kilos and they were being sold at 104 kilos. At weaning at 5.4, the range in weights around those pigs was 6.8 kilos. The range is bigger than the mean. Standard deviation of 1.2, so that's the spread in weights, and a coefficient of variation, which is the standard deviation divided by the mean, of 22%. Which pig do I target nutritionally? As pigs get bigger, the actual spread around the mean decreases, but the spread per se increases. When we get to 100 kilos, there is a 50 kilo range in the weight of the pigs at the same age. Which pig do I target? I want to sit there and split the atom with my diet spec, and I'm feeding anything from 75 to 125 kilos. They are going to have varying requirements. And what's that going to do? It's going to generate more variation when I sell that pig. Why are these pigs fat? Well, because there's 50 kilo range and I'm feeding a pig that's supposed to be 100 kilos. Very difficult. So that's what we're dealing with. Other costs, grading loss. and we work into some specific markets that have very tight grids. That costs us money to meet that grid if we want to optimise the number of prime pigs in there. Pre-weaning mortality. As you have more pigs in a litter and a wider range, wider range in birth weight, the actual capacity of the smaller pigs to compete for teats diminishes. And that can further increase standard deviation and coefficient of variation. And then there's health management. It's the same as nutrition. The veterinarian is targeting a medication regime to an assumed weight. And if you have that kind of range, you're going to have a heap of pigs that aren't getting enough and a heap of pigs that are getting too much. And that, again, will contribute to more variation and certainly contributes to increased costs. So what can we do about it? I'm going to focus today on some nutritional solutions. There aren't many, so don't, sit there waiting. We do a lot from standard management point of view, but enhanced environments in Australia is going to be a major contributor, particularly around the sow. Split-sex housing and feeding, that is one way to contain variation. It's very difficult, almost impossible, to reduce variation. Phase feeding, not new. Segregated parity flows, so taking your gilts and feeding them separately to the way you feed your gilt progeny and feeding them differently to the way you feed all the other progeny. High health systems, for the same type of reasons that Mark was covering. If you have a high health system, you're going to reduce the variation in response of individual pigs to the same inputs. Cross-fostering as a means of trying to support the smaller piglets. Split weaning, same way, but at the other end, you're leaving the lighter pigs on for longer. Increased weaning age, that's a management practice that we might practice. It's not necessarily a solution, and if that increased weaning age increases weight loss in the sow, it'll make the problem worse. So it's not necessarily a great solution. And then reduced variation in weaning age, well, that is just a sheer numbers game. You don't need me to point it out. If your coefficient of variation is already less than 10 or 12%, you're probably doing quite well, and to get better than that, you're going to need massive management and structural changes to improve. So if we think about all that, I suppose the bottom line is, if standard deviation increases with age, any intervention that reduces that initial variation will have the greatest effect. So try and reduce initial variation. And that, of course, starts around gestation, lactation, even in the weaning to oestrus period, and then pre and post weaning. So let's look at what our options might be there. Before we even get there, I talked about our car manufacturing plant. All breeding and growth phases, if you don't know what you're putting in, you're going to be generating variation. Different pigs will respond differently. You need to characterise as many raw materials as you possibly can so you have at least a rough idea about the nutrients these pigs are consuming and hopefully reducing an increase in variation as you go along. Gestation. It is very difficult to manipulate the range in weights of piglets in gestation. And as litter sizes get bigger, that range in weights will get bigger. Is that right? Just checking. We spend a lot of time thinking about gestation, and there's all sorts of different theories about how you feed a gestating sow. You need an increase at the beginning, you need an increase at the end, feed them a low amount in the middle. Nutrition of gestating sows is not very complex. And it comes down to the fact, and this was pointed out by Alan Bell, Professor of Animal Science, who's very well known in Australia and overseas, and I'd never thought about it, sometimes it's staring you in the face. Even though a pig might have 10 or 12 piglets, if you take the combined weight of that conceptus and compare it to the overall body weight of the sow, it is actually a very small amount of the body weight relative to the body weight of the sow, compared to the comparable weight of a calf to a cow, or a foal to a horse, or a lamb to a sheep. In reality, a sow in the wild is there to survive and look after herself. The piglets come onto the ground, and then she puts everything into lactation to keep them alive and get them as big and ugly as possible. The actual demands and fine-tuning required during gestation are not that great. They don't have a big nutrient demand. So it's more about making sure you're not having that sow vary in body weight dramatically. That's going to have a big impact. If we look at an experiment where there was quite an extreme variation in nutrient inputs and the subsequent effect on birth weight, weaning weight, and within litter variation, these pigs were fed everything from 30 megajoules of DE per day for the entire gestation to fluctuating between 30 to 60 for 25 to 50 days versus 30 to 60 for 50 to 80 days versus 30 to 60 for 25 to 80. That's a massive change in nutrient input during gestation. No effect on birth weight, weaning weight, or within litter variation. From a cost point of view, this is going to win. Can we do anything with amino acids? Maybe. There's been a lot of talk about the role of arginine increasing litter size, and this was reviewed in conjunction with glutamine, which is an excellent cellular energy source. Reduced birth weight variation when the lysine to arginine ratio was changed. And it was based on the fact that there is extensive catabolism of arginine in the small intestine and a very high uptake of glutamine in the uterus and the placental and fetal fluids. When glutamine and arginine were added to corn and soy-based diets, where the control diet might have contained 0.16% of arginine, top dressed between day 30 and 114, to a complete diet that only started with 0.7 and 1.2 of arginine and glutamine respectively, compared to 8 grams of arginine and 12 grams of glutamine over that basal diet to lift it to 1.1 and 1.8%, they actually found that here we have the control data, here we have the supplemented arginine and glutamine diets. In the maternal plasma, they were able to detect a significant increase in the arginine content. They couldn't with glutamine, which is not expected given how it's metabolized, decrease the level of ammonia in the plasma and decrease the level of urea, suggesting more efficient utilization of those amino acids. They saw an increase in piglets born. That's not necessarily unexpected or inconsistent with other data, but most importantly, the coefficient in variation of birth weight, and we saw how big that problem can be, dropped from 17% down to 12%, and that was significant, and that was carried across in the born alive. So not a difficult thing that might stem some of the problem initially. There's this other issue of fetal pre-programming, where, and this is probably more pertinent with gilts, where we know that you don't really have a big impact nutritionally on that primary fibre development, but perhaps can have an impact on secondary fibres. If this nutrition is adequate and those pigs have the same level of primary, secondary, tertiary fibres, you're going to reduce their variation in capacity to grow as they get older. Lactation. What do? This is where you need to focus. It's obviously the primary influence on postnatal performance. Increased catabolism and late lactation will reduce embryonic survival and development, and there is a significant relationship between sow body condition and the CV of birth weight. Litter heterogeneity can increase with body weight, and that occurs at the beginning and end of gestation. I suppose I can't overemphasise the importance of feeding during lactation, trying to optimise milk production, trying to minimise sow body weight loss, and the impact that that could then have on the subsequent gestation, and Mark's already talked about that, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on it. Our objective has to be optimise milk production, stop them having massive fluctuations in body condition. You won't need that remedial feeding when they go back into gestation. Interestingly enough, when you look at nutritional solutions, there does appear to be some data that during that wean to estrus interval, you might be able to have an impact on variation. It was simply through dextrose supplementation, where 150 grams of dextrose per day was added to a 3.5 kilo per day dry sow diet, with dextrose being specific as opposed to any form of starch supplementation, where they found that through that supplementation, they were able to reduce the CV significantly again of birth weight. So quite a simple thing that you might be able to apply at farm level. Pre-weaning, all systems have to focus on sow milk production and adequate colostrum supply. If you can do that across as many piglets, you're off to a better start. And these targets of 75 to 85 kilos of litter weight, regardless of litter size, at 21 days are certainly worth pursuing on farm and making sure you're at least within a bull's roar. Go home, if it's not a focus, I bet you're somewhere between 55 and 60. Another thing to remember too is light birth weight piglets actually have a capacity to grow. They can outperform their heavier litter mates in terms of net increase in gain. So it is worth trying to look at some kind of, well, just remember that when you're talking about focusing on lactation feeding. Split suckling, removal of larger piglets from the dam 24 hours post-birth, doesn't really have an impact on ADG or weaning weight, but there can be linear improvements in standard deviation and the coefficient of variation. So worth considering if you're trying to reduce variation. Supplementary milk, not a lot of evidence that it can reduce variation. It increases total size, but we're talking about changing variation. Creep feeding, again, very limited evidence that creep feeding can reduce variation, and that creep feeding behaviour only accounts for a very small proportion of within litter variation. So that's worth remembering too. Just finally, this is some CRC work. Can we actually reduce variation by feeding our lightweight piglets a significantly enhanced feeding regime post-weaning? And the answer is no. So in this regime, we had a standard feeding regime. We took higher birth weight pigs and they changed diets at the same weight as the control. So obviously they got their changes earlier. For the low birth weight piglets, and they were low, we fed creep feed for 90 plus days. That cost a lot of money. You are not going to put a nutrition regime in place that will exceed that. So I'm not advocating it, I'm just saying, well, if we can't get an improvement there, we're not going to get an improvement, all right? So this just gave you an idea of the diets, but they were high-spec diets with lots of energy, lots of amino acids when we were talking about the creep feed. If we look at what happens post-weaning, they were light, so they were weaned at 19 days, 4.4 kilos entry, 3.8 was the low side, 5.2 was the high. Okay, you can see obviously by splitting them off, you reduce the variation within each one of those groups, that's fine. But by the time those groups get up to slaughter, all that variation's come back within them. Interesting. Obviously, well, here you can see that those low birth weight pigs never caught up. And it really came down to the fact that light piglets eat less and always will. But when you compare some of those growth rates, they can still outperform their litter mates at the same body weight. So they can grow. But that's the issue. So really, you've got to reduce the variation, nip it in the bud before it starts. There's no point trying to make up for it after they have been weaned. And when you look at all our data from our experimental work, there is a linear relationship, very strong, that shows when you wean them, if they're light, they'll stay light. And that 4 to 8 kilo range there turns into an 8 to 18 kilo range 4 weeks later. Very simple. So, to conclude, variation is difficult to contain, but if you're going to contain it, you need to start early. Not a lot of things you can do in gestation. There's no effective DE, maybe some supplementation with arginine and glutamine. Lactation, simple, optimise milk production, minimise sow weight loss, maybe split suckling. Wean to estrus, you might be able to supplement with some dextrose, but beyond that, there's not a lot you can do to change your fate. Thank you. I presume that's
Rob, I think, yeah, even I found that interesting. So, so we got 5 minutes for questions. We can't go over too long simply because there's another session in here after this and you'll miss out on the coffee. So time for about 2 or 3 questions. Are any in the audience?
same time.
Well, I'm surprised. But if there's not, Rob...
I'll get one, Rob. Sorry, Chris Brewster. Take your scientist hat off, put your futurist hat on, and of everything that's out there, what gives you the most opportunity that we can work with this variation that's inherent in our biological system? Where are your thoughts there, Rob?
I'll give him a whole bloody strategic plan if you like. I suppose that variation only increases when we start cutting pigs up into bits and trying to put them into different markets. I suppose if you looked at the futurist talk yesterday and he was talking about the fact that we only sell meat, I think that was quite pertinent. And it's not about getting pigs to grow wool, but it's about having as many avenues or outlets for as many parts of that pig as we possibly can at any point in time, so that we're never beholden to the situation that was being discussed at the delegates meeting, like, price of bellies dropped, so the guts drops out of the value of the whole pig. So really, I think going forward, we know the pig is a very versatile animal. It really comes down to us, not only in terms of consumption, but looking for as many outlets, profitable outlets, for as many parts of the pig as we can, to accommodate the inherent variation that we're going to get through pigs that don't hit prime or change in demand for a particular cut or whatever else. So for me, that was an area where I thought the futurists might have hit the nail on the head, to make sure that we increase the diversity of endpoints, if you like, from a single animal. Oh, there's a futurist here. He might have... go, that's bullshit.
Go ahead.
I'm going to say that in public about you, Rob.
Yeah.
You have before.
So I've actually got a question. You said during the middle about subsequent reproductive performance with higher weaning ages. So take your science hat off and put your pig farmer I want to make money hat on. Where do you see the balance between those two?
I mean, well, I'm far more focused on a target weight at an age as opposed to an age per se. And that again will reflect your capacity to effectively feed during lactation. So that to me is the focus. I'm very much against just pushing weaning age out for the sake of pushing weaning age out, because if you handle that poorly, you can not only increase the level of weight loss in a sow, you can start losing weight off those piglets as well. It's not, this magic panacea. And so I'm very much focused on things like that litter weight at 21 days, because it reflects very well your effectiveness of your lactation feeding regime. And if you're hitting those 75 to 85 kilo targets at 21 days, well, I'd be weaning them in a heartbeat. So.
Good question. Last question, the gentleman in the pink shirt.
Can you just explain with the supplementing of the dextrose, is that done just post-weaning for the sow, or is that actually done during lactation?
No, in that experiment, it was specifically during the wean to estrus period.
Okay.
And it probably relates back to some of Mark's suggestions around the role of carbohydrate and so forth in reproductive efficiency, but it's, pretty simple thing that you might like to apply.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, I'm going to have to stop it there, Rob, and a small appreciation.
Thank you, Rog.
Thank you, appreciate it very much.
Right,
Thank
cheers.
you.